Hello, and welcome to Bitesized Audio on YouTube. I'm Simon Stanhope, actor, audiobook narrator, and curator of this channel. On the channel, I narrate classic short stories, mostly from the Victorian and Edwardian eras, including vintage ghost stories, detective stories, and other classic tales of mystery and suspense. I put notes in the video description with some background information on the authors and the stories if you'd like to read more, and you'll also find links to playlists and podcast series, as well as some compilation videos if you'd like a longer listen. If you enjoy this content, please subscribe, like, share, leave a comment if you'd like to, and thank you for listening. Private Water by A.J. Allen. There's a man in the department where I work who's a great friend of mine, in spite of the fact that we share a room, and this story's all about him. He says he doesn't mind, but in order not to identify him too closely, I'm just going to call him Henry. It all began one morning a few months ago, when he staggered into the office with a huge great iron thing, like the wheel of a traction engine. I said, "What in the world's that?" He said, "Oh, didn't you know? I've had a country cottage given me, and this is the base of a petrol engine I bought to pump the water out of the well with, because it's too much fag to do it by hand." He went on to say that he wasn't going to use the iron base, as he thought a concrete bed would be better. Well, this was the first I'd heard of this cottage, because I'd been away on leave, but it was apparently somewhere in Norfolk, and it had been given him by his mother. He did tell me how she'd come by it, but I've forgotten. The point is that she didn't want it herself, so she'd passed it on to Henry. He was rather vague as to its exact location, as he'd only been down once by road, but it seemed quite a decent sort of place. It was furnished after a fashion, so he said, but it would want a whole lot doing to it, so they were going down each weekend and getting it into shape by degrees. As time went on, I naturally heard a good deal about how things were going. You do when you are in the same office as a man, and I couldn't help noticing that everything that could go wrong was doing. And when I say everything, I mean everything. It was almost uncanny. The most complete chapter of accidents happened in connection with the well, so I'll just quote it as an example. This well was bang in the middle of the lawn, and it looked quite decorative, but Mrs. Henry struck at the idea of installing a pump and a blooming great petrol engine alongside it. So what they decided to do was to sink the pump in the ground close to the well and stick the engine right away to the side somewhere. The engine was to transmit its power to the pump along a series of wheels and belts. These were to be down out of sight in a trench. Well, first of all, the concrete bed for the engine kept on cracking. The local builder must have got his quantities wrong. Anyway, he had to remake it 3 times before it would stand up to its job. Then one of the driving wheels in the trench was mounted slightly out of true, and every now and then its belt came off. This, of course, whizzed along and fouled all the other belts, and they said, "Let's all go down the trench," and the poor old pump got the lot. Then again, about the engine. It occurred to the Henrys that it would be bad for it to stand out in all weathers without a thing on, as it were, so they got hold of some matchboarding in felt and built a sort of chicken house round it, and they tell me it looked very fine, but not for long. That completely disappeared. Someone must have come along during the week and taken it away. Even that wasn't the end of their hydraulic troubles. When they'd finally got the whole arrangement working and actual water was being produced, they thought they'd better have some of it analysed, and the answer was 3% of organic matter. Luckily, it turned out to be only a dead rabbit, but coming on the top of everything else, it did really look more than mere chance. I said to Henry, "Norfolk doesn't seem to want you. Whom have you been annoying?" He said, "We can't have been annoying anyone, because there isn't another house in sight," but he agreed that it was all very strange. However, by the middle of April, they seemed to have overcome the last of their troubles, and they went down and achieved a completely enjoyable weekend. But it was so quiet in the evenings that they thought a wireless set might liven things up a bit. Would I go down and help him install it? I said I would, and we all drove down on the following Saturday. We both had to go to the office in the morning. I forget why, and we didn't arrive until late in the afternoon. A perfectly gorgeous spot, but rather difficult to describe. Its position, I mean. You approached it down a long lane all overgrown with grass, which appeared to lead straight into a small river. But just before we took the final plunge, there was a gate on the right-hand side, and Henry said, "Here we are." His domain consisted of 2 cottages knocked into one, with a lawn in front, and past the bottom of this lawn flowed the river. At the back of the cottages there was a sort of barn place, which they used as a garage. I'm telling you all this because the general layout is rather important. First of all we had tea, and then I thought we'd better get the aerial up in case it turned wet. So we set to work. We didn't have to bother about a mast, because there was a convenient tree down by the river, but even so it took longer than we expected. Jobs like that always do, and it was pretty nearly dark before we'd finished. Just as I was beginning to climb down the tree for the last time, I noticed a light shining not far off, not more than a few 100 yards anyway. I thought it was strange, because Henry had said there was nothing within miles of them, so I called out, "What's that light over there?" Henry couldn't see it from the ground, and said, "What light?" But just then there were loud cries of dinner from the house, and the subject dropped. Afterwards we connected up the set and got quite good signals, even without a proper earth. All we had was a few feet of wire lying on the grass, but Mrs. Henry didn't like that, in case it got left there permanently. So Henry said, "All right, there's some wire netting in the loft over the garage. We could bury that. Let's go and get it." I murmured, "Must we?" But they didn't hear, and along we went with an electric torch and climbed the ladder into this infernal loft. We located the netting all right, but to get at it we had to move a lot of old planks and things, and underneath we came across a great long thing done up in canvas. We undid it, and it turned out to be a canoe, a Canadian canoe, complete with 2 paddles. This was a distinct find, although there was no saying what condition it might be in, but we said "Good-o," and lowered it through the trapdoor on chance. By the time we'd buried the wire netting, it was 10 o'clock, and we all went to bed. Now, I'm not used to going to bed at 10, and the result was that next morning I was wide awake at 6. I got up and looked at the weather. Not a cloud in the sky, or a breath of wind. I decided that it would be a sin to stay frowsting in bed a moment longer, and not only that. My room was next to the bathroom, and I was terrified that Henry might come along and sing in it, so I strolled down and had a look at the river, and that immediately reminded me of the canoe. I went and fetched it from outside the garage, and put it in the water, and to my great surprise it didn't leak. So I got in and paddled away downstream. Not that there was much stream, you could hardly tell which way it was flowing. It meandered about, like my stories, and after I'd gone a few 100 yards, and was meaning to turn back, I came to a place where there was a chain across. There was also a notice board, which said, "Private Water." That settled it. It was a perfect morning for trespassing, so I scraped under the chain and went on. No one seemed to mind, except numerous waterfowl, which got up and flew away, uttering piercing cries. I expect they didn't like the colour of my pyjamas. Evidently provincial birds. A minute or two later, the river took a sharp turn to the left, and led into quite a large sheet of water. By large, I mean about half a mile long, and a couple of 100 yards wide. And it wasn't till then that it struck me that this must be one of the smaller Broads. Across the middle of this Broad there was a winding row of posts, apparently to mark the course of the river, but it occurred to me that it ought to have been able to find its way without that. Anyhow, I followed the posts and got through a narrow opening on the far side into a still larger river. By the way, before I actually went through the opening, I noticed a peculiar sort of hut standing near the edge of the lake. It had got a coke stove outside it, and, as far as one could see, the flue of the stove went deliberately in at one end of the hut and came out at the other. Leaning up against the wall of this hut were several sacks, which I put down as containing coke for the stove. They were a bit light in colour, but perhaps they were young ones. And then I got through into the main river. A few yards downstream, immediately to my right, there was a large wherry moored against the bank. A wherry, by the way, is a sort of sailing barge, got up pretty. I hadn't spotted her before, because the river-bank was too high, and they'd taken the mast out of her. She was evidently there for keeps, from the look of her moorings, but lying astern of her was an extremely serviceable motor-boat. I should have liked to have gone on board her and had a look round, but hanging up in the bows there was a large flat fish, obviously maturing for bait, which was quite unapproachable, so I paddled frantically out of range and back to breakfast. Henry met me when I landed and said, "Where have you been?" I said, "I've been to trace what that light was I saw last night." He said, "Oh, really? What was it?" Not a bit interested, and I said, "If you must know, it was a piece of fish hanging up to ripen on board a motor-boat out in the river there." He still didn't seem impressed. He simply said, "I'm glad you've got back, because our infernal pump's gone wrong again." Putting it right took us until goodness knows when, but somewhere about 6, a small boy turned up from the outer world with a message about some eggs. He also mentioned that there'd been a mail van robbery in the neighbourhood the afternoon before. I immediately thought of my row of pale-coloured sacks. I said, "Splendid! I can tell you where the swag is." And then I absolutely made them listen to my tale of adventure in the morning, and I put it to them. I said, "Why don't we go along in the canoe tonight and fetch one of those sacks and make sure?" Well, Henry thought it would be quite a good scheme, so after dinner we went, just he and I. It was pitch dark, but you can always see on the water, and we got to the hut and found that the sacks were still there. We chose a nice fat one and solemnly carted it all the way back to the cottage. But when we opened it in the middle of the sitting-room floor, all we found inside was a whole lot of dried leaves. Rather a sell on the face of it, but Henry said, "Yes, but what is this stuff?" And we tried various things, and finally burnt a bit. That left no room for doubt at all. It was tobacco. Whereupon I had one of my brilliant ideas. I said, "If I'm right, we are on to a far bigger show than a mail van robbery. That river over there is the Ant. The Ant runs into the Bure. The Bure and the Yare meet and run into the sea at Yarmouth. Now, let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that this fellow in the wherry goes in for smuggling. He starts off by making a reputation for himself as a fisherman. He can get to Yarmouth in an hour in his motorboat, and he goes in and out at all sorts of odd times, until no one ever takes any notice of him. Very well. As soon as he gets to that stage, he goes out every now and then, ostensibly after bloater, and meets another motorboat somewhere out to sea. This other motorboat may have come from Belgium, or anywhere you like, with a cargo of tobacco. He picks up this cargo and brings it back here, miles inland. In due course he puts it ashore at the foot of your lane, and it goes up to London by lorry. That's why everything's gone wrong here. He naturally doesn't want anyone living right at his back door." I admit that this seemed a hopelessly far-fetched theory, but how else could you explain 1/4 of a ton of tobacco in an out-of-the-way place like that? Anyway, we couldn't explain it, and then we began to get rather indignant. Not that we objected to smuggling per se. Why, I remember once coming ashore at Chatham so stuffed out with what my friends were going to smoke during a week's leave that they had to carry me on a stretcher. But that was different. It was wartime. However, this was a clear case of unfair competition with home industries, and we all had shares in the Imperial Tobacco Company, and we were just discussing what we ought to do about it when there was a ring at the bell, and lo and behold, it was a policeman. Mind you, this was hardly a coincidence. He'd been round the Saturday before, selling tickets for some country police fete, and he'd called about that. At all events, we said, "Come in, you're just the man we want." So we sat him down and gave him a drink, and then we produced the sack and said, "What do you think that is?" He just looked at it and said, "I know what it is. It's tobacco. Where did you get it?" So I started to tell him about the wherry and all that, and he said, "Oh, yes, that belongs to Mr. de Voyker, a Dutch gentleman. We know all about him." I said, "Do you also know that he smuggles tobacco?" And he burst out laughing. He said, "Smuggles it? He doesn't have to smuggle it, he grows it. He's got 16 acres under cultivation on the other side of the river. Didn't you see his drying shed?" And of course I had, only I didn't know what it was. Well, you can imagine how foolish we felt. Our Bobby was evidently conversant with the technical side of the business, and he went on to explain that the stuff we'd brought away was actually waste which couldn't be used, but it had to be disposed of in some particular way under the eagle eye of an excise officer, otherwise duty would have to be paid on it. Henry said, "Does that mean we've got to take this rotten stuff back?" And Robert was afraid that it did mean exactly that. The worst of it was that we should have to do it that night, because we were making a very early start next morning. So Robert was given what they call the other half, and duly seen off, and then Henry and I got into the canoe and paddled all the way back to de Voyker's shed with this blessed sack. When we eventually got back to the cottage, we found Mrs. Henry pacing nervously backwards and forwards on the lawn. She said, "I'm so glad you've come, because there's something funny going on further up the lane. The weirdest noises are being made." We could hear them ourselves, strange, odd crashes at regular intervals. So we went along to investigate, and found that it was friend Robert, still trying to get on his bicycle. Quite astounding. I thought policemen were like firemen, and that it didn't matter what you gave them, but they can't be. He was awfully pleased to see us, and said that if we'd only hold his bicycle still while he mounted, and then give him a push, he'd be quite all right. But I said, "No, my lad, I think not." I should hate to get a policeman into trouble, and there was no doubt that we were, in some measure, responsible for his unfortunate condition. That being so, we felt we ought to do the right thing by him, so while Henry was getting the car out, I brushed him down and found his helmet, and then we took him and his bicycle home. Next morning we all came back to London, I having had a most amusing time, so much so, in fact, that I'd brought away a little memento of it. As you may possibly imagine, I hadn't entirely swallowed the policeman's explanation of the sack of tobacco, and while the Henrys were seeing him off the night before, I'd had another look at it. The top layer certainly was rubbish, stalks and so on, but once you got down below that, the whole of the rest of the sack was stuffed tight with neat bundles of unbroken leaves, tied up with cotton. Well, I'd taken out one of these bundles and kept it, and when I left the office that evening, I went and called on my tobacconist. I plonked my bundle down in front of him and said, "What's that?" He proceeded to do various things to it. He first of all cut the cotton, and breathed on the edges. Then he fanned out the leaves and smelt them, and said, "That's very fine." I asked him what it was worth. He said, "Well, it all depends. Without the duty, it's worth about 6pence a pound, but with the duty, it's about 10 shillings. Isn't it iniquitous?" I next asked him whether it could be grown in England, and he laughed. He said, "Good gracious, no. That's the very best Virginia pipe tobacco. Can you get any more?" I said, "Yes, rather. The next dark weekend." You've been listening to a bite-sized audiobook, read by me, Simon Stanhope. If you enjoy these stories and would like to help me to keep producing new content, you can find links in the video description to my Patreon page or to buy me a coffee. Another way to support me is through my Bandcamp page, bitesizedaudio.bandcamp.com, where you can hear my narrations of many more classic short stories, as well as purchase and download them to keep. This recording is copyright Bitesized Audio 2025. Thank you for listening.